Okay, on the motion that this House would only allow nudity in the media that plays a role in the story or furthers the narrative, let's please welcome to the floor Prime Minister.
In an age where we are really comfortable with seeing girls in bikinis and scantily clad men and women, nudity remains the last frontier of human decency and continues to be something that in people, even the ones who are the most debaucherous, are somewhat uncomfortable with and continues to shock and offend. And what we say, members of this House, is because we recognize that nudity, when it is not purposeful, when it's only gratuitous, what happens is that it makes people uncomfortable and creates certain harms on the kind of sexual norms that we want to perpetuate in society. I'm going to talk about three things in my speech. Firstly, answering the question of where we draw the line and what do we stand for on the government side. Secondly, why do we think that the state can censor in this particular circumstance? And lastly, what do we think are the kind of harms that come about as a result of gratuitous nudity that we can control with our policy? So firstly, where do we draw the line? Basically, what we do is that for all the dramas, movies, and that they already go through rating requests and applications, we will use that particular process and leverage upon it. And what we'll do is that we require script writers and directors to justify the scenes and to explain to the censors the narrative purpose of that particular scene and explain why that particular nudity is necessary, or why it cannot be accomplished through some other narrative means, right? So I'll take it in a moment. And that particular purpose and narrative purpose must be obvious to the story. I'll give you some examples in a little bit, but before that, yes.
Why is narrative the only aspect of art that matters?
Because at the end of the day, we think that what happens here is that a narrative plays a functional purpose when it comes to telling stories on the media, right? When it comes to movies and scripts, their goal is to tell a story. So if it's fundamental to telling the story, we think that there's a functional purpose that is worthy enough for us to allow it in the first place. But let me draw the line for you, right? So it's be obvious for the audience. You cannot bush and say that, the prostitutes in the random scene in Game of Thrones in the brothel has to be naked because, we're going to create this also sexual environment, right? You can't bush it your way through. The kind of things we will pass are things like, for example, in Last Caution, right, where you try to demonstrate the primal nature of the relationship and the abusive sexual nature of the relationship between the two leads. We're happy to have that because there's a functional purpose to explaining the relationship between the two leads, right? Or for example, in Titanic, right, where Kate Winslet was topless for the drawing of a portrait, we think that was necessary as well because it allowed us or the audience to understand that this was a woman, even though she was from upper class, she was willing to display her intimate side to DiCaprio in the particular scene, even though she didn't possess the kind of a relationship with her betrothed, right? So we think that those are things that we're happy to stand for because they serve a functional purpose. Why do we think that then the state can censor? Because we think that in this particular circumstance, in any circumstance, the state always steps in to balance freedom of speech and its effect on society, right? So for example, we never ever give the carte blanche right for people to say anything they want in any circumstance that they want. And so in this case, for example, we believe like hate speech, right? Like for example, we allow people to say racist things and anything they want, but we draw the line when they go above and beyond and say that we should conduct violence upon another group, right? The state always comes in and acts the moral locus to say that there is an extent and the buck stops here. We think that and so what happens is that the state makes active trade-off for citizens and recognizes that ultimately certain kind of speech has harms, but speech in itself is virtuous, right? So in this particular case, what we believe is that where you draw the line is a functional purpose, right? So we are able to recognize that sometimes nudity is legitimate, right? So for example, in the female protesters, right, we allow that kind of nudity to be aired on the media because we recognize that that's part of the narrative process that female as a political group is trying to advance. But when the nudity is unnecessary, for example, someone is just randomly walking naked down the street because it feels as though that's something that he wants to do, we think that that's illegitimate because it creates harm upon others, because when they see that particular nudity, they feel discomfort, they feel offended, and it hurts them, right? So we think that there are certain trade-offs that we make. And in this circumstance, we think that gratuitous sexual imagery is unnecessary because there's no purpose in the role of telling that particular story, right? It's there in order to titillate and to attract men or women to watch it because it's somewhat like pornography and it's more socially acceptable. We think that's something that we do not stand for. And so that brings me nicely to the harms that come as a result of this gratuitous nudity, right? Because what we argue is that it worsens the objectification of both men and women sexually in society. There's a difference between nudity as a gratuitous visual versus a nudity that is there to advance the narrative, because it affects the production of these particular sort of scenes, right? So, for example, if you're trying to produce a scene that has gratuitous sexual content, right? So basically, you want to attract people to watch your show through, lots of tits and lots of ads, right? So you have to do that, right? So if your goal is like that, the production and direction will be going towards pertaining to the more objectified way that men already see women within society. So a lot like pornography, where we focus on the boobs, where we focus on like the sexual parts of the men or women, right? So we think that what happens when you allow this is that more often than not, these portrayals of the body parts will be more sexualized and more objectified in comparison to where the nudity is for the artistic is for a narrative purpose, because. And in comparison, the difference here is that when you need to talk about the storyline, it's not just about the boobs, or not just about, like, for example, you try to tell the story of intimacy that involved between Kate Winslet and DiCaprio. You cannot just focus on Kate Winslet's looks and say, and just look at it on the story that's taking place, right? You have to take a more macro stance. And so what happens is that the way that these content is produced is less likely to be objectified. In comparison, what we say also is that it affects the way that audiences receive this as well. So what happens when you see nudity not in relation to any part of the story, is that you tend to see it as something that is objectified. There's a tool of sexual gratification, as something that is there only because it is there for me to look at it and jerk off to, right? We think that that's something that's extremely unnecessary, and in fact perpetuate this idea that women or men are particular objects. Given, especially since that there is already an existing norm whereby women are far more objectified than men within society, it worsens that, because now you continue to allow young boys to look at this sort of images and go, hey, yeah, that's something that is perfectly okay, and young boys form their understanding of women based on their sort of impression. And we don't think that this is far worse in pornography, because it exists in mainstream media and they can have very easy access to it. You can say, oh, I'm just watching Game of Thrones, it's nothing, right? And what we argue with ourselves in comparison is that when they see this news in the context of a storyline, is that they don't recognize these women as just bodily sexual objects, but also part of important relationships, right? So for example, when we saw the nudity in Titanic, we don't see Kate Winslet as a sexual object, but rather we saw that scene for this relationship that Jack was building with Rose, right? And we think that that's far better because the audience receives it not in a way that perpetuates sexual objectification norms, but rather that women are equal and nudity is something that's called the intimate process between men and women. We think that's only achieved if the nudity is constrained to just the narrative. At the end of the day, members of this house, we must recognize that there is a line to be drawn. And this is something that we need to do in order to stop the bug of sexual objectification in society. For all these reasons, we are proud to propose.
Thank the previous speaker for his speech, and would now like to welcome the opposition leader. Here.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The burden on this side of narrative in today's debate are twofold. Firstly, they have to tell us why those for example, the picture of naked body women, which are used in the public media, are not necessary. Although we took Tojin POI from Thomas, that those things, although they might not be used in playing a role, although they might not be used in furthering a narrative, that might have artistic value, which is as important as those that are used in playing a role or furthering the narrative. They have to tell us why in those circumstances those things are unnecessary in any sense. But second of all, they have to tell us why there is overwhelming harm. Although, as I'm going to tell you in my first substantive response to the Prime Minister, there's a high threshold of intervening in the freedom of speech and restricting the free expression, especially in the field of art, and therefore there is a twofold burden which they have to meet for the general debate. So what I'm going to do in my LO speech are largely three things. Firstly, direct response to the Prime Minister, and secondly, I'm going to talk about briefly talk about the principle of free expression, especially in the field of art, and why we think there should be a high threshold, and why we don't think they have shown we are legitimately prohibit this sort of expressions. And lastly, I'm going to talk about the most important point, which is about how nudity have artistic value, even though they might not be used for playing a role or furthering the narrative. So my first point is about direct response to the previous speaker. And the previous speaker talked about how the state was censored, and the example was hate speech, which was only banned in, for example, like 8 countries and so on. So, for example, in the United States, hate speech is not banned, and that applies for many other countries. Sit down, please. And also, Mr. Speaker, now the example of hate speech is funny because he openly concedes that hate speech is meant to incite violence, which does not apply for the nudity, Madam Speaker. Now, we need to have the causal link, and the Supreme Court of the United States introduced and implemented the criteria of clear and present danger. That is the reason why hate speech might be censored, but all the other speeches, Madam Speaker, including the nudity, and therefore, that's why their first argument simply doesn't stand. And also, next he talks about how there's a harm, Madam Speaker, and this is entirely based upon the assertion that when those nudity is used for their functional purpose, that suddenly cease to be offensive, that suddenly cease to be non-objectifying, and that was an entirely weak assumption, which was not justified by the previous speaker, because they used a very convenient example of Titanic, but which we don't think applies for all the other cases which are used, Madam Speaker. For example, in order to sell, Madam Speaker, to be sensational, those, for example, artists or movie makers might use, for example, sexy girls picture, Madam Speaker, to sell more and also appeal to the audience innate desire to see those pictures, and therefore, in those circumstances, they are not any less objectifying, they are not any less offensive than the nudity which they are protecting, Madam Speaker. So basically, their assumption doesn't stand, this argument is simply false. And also, Madam Speaker, even though they might be a bit less objectifying or a bit less offensive, Madam Speaker, we say that people who are conservative, for example, might find it still offensive, and therefore their criteria of offense, Madam Speaker, does not justify the distinction they have to draw. And also for the effect of creating an undesirable norm, we are happy to censor those things only for the underage children, which we already see in the status quo. And then the children having unfair bias is not going to be a problem, which is mutually exclusive, which is not mutually exclusive, and therefore the argument doesn't stand. My first substantive is about briefly about the principle of free expression, and why we think that should extend to this case of nudity as well. Now, as I said, there should be a high threshold which should be used to for the government to censor those any expression, but especially in the field of art, Madam Speaker, because people have different senses and sensitivities, and therefore, if they introduce a criteria of offensiveness, they have to censor every single artistic work, and therefore, for example, even under the proposal, as I flagged in my responses, Madam Speaker, even though those nudity might be used to play a role, even though those nudity might be used to further the narrative, those things might be found as offensive, Madam Speaker, by the people who read and enjoy those arts, and therefore, Madam Speaker, and that simply shows the criteria they give us is not a legitimate one. The criteria they use cannot distinguish what they're trying to protect, what we are trying to protect in the status quo, and therefore we think the argument simply doesn't stand. The free expression should be protected in this circumstance. I think.
How are you able to draw a line as to what has artistic merit or not when you allow every single depiction of nudity in your policy?
Okay, so what I'm going to tell you is that in general, Madam Speaker, those nudity have artistic value. They rather have to explain how they're going to draw the line based upon the artistic value, Madam Speaker, between the nudity they're trying to protect and the nudity in general, which we are trying to protect. So my second point is about the most important point about the artistic value. Now, we accept that nudity do not play a role in the story, and they might not part of the narrative, Madam Speaker, but still, for example, the sculpture, which does not fit their criteria, but still we think they have artistic value. For example, although they are not playing a role or character, for example, from things like shape and color and shadowing, those sculptures are used for the artistic value for millennia, Madam Speaker. We pointed the example, most obvious example, a known example of Venus of ancient Greece, Madam Speaker. Those things are still admired in this day and age, and furthermore, those things were referenced by the later artists who made great work. We point to the example of Michelangelo in the Renaissance, Madam Speaker. Now, even after 1,000 years ago, those Venus of ancient Greece, the nudity was referenced and gave us inspiration to those later artists who eventually made a great work. And then we can clearly see from those examples that those nudity have artistic value, even though they do not fit their criteria coming from their policy side. And furthermore, what we say is that even within, for example, movies and books, Madam Speaker, even though they are not particularly playing a role, for example, they are useful in showing the settings of those particular words, Madam Speaker. For example, there are some nudity which is used to show a setting where, for example, females were objectified, Madam Speaker, or for example, nudity which was used to show that physical power was particularly physical power was particularly emphasized in that particular moment of time to kind of like show the social norm at that point of time in that particular society, and therefore even though they are not particularly playing a role or particularly playing a character to show the setting of that particular work, those nudity are extremely useful, Madam Speaker. Now they might say on the affirmative that those setting is not cannot be distinguished from, for example, playing a role or following a narrative, but that is obviously not true, Madam Speaker, because for example we quote the example of Hamlet, Madam Speaker, the famous work coming from Shakespeare. Now the story and the character of Hamlet has been unchanged throughout the history. Now all the characters and all the major roles of Hamlet have been unchanged, no matter what time it was performed. But still, the setting of Hamlet has been greatly changed. Hamlet was originally produced in the 15th century by Shakespeare, but now when we see the Hamlet being performed in this day and age, Hamlet was given and performed in another setting, Madam Speaker, which is newer than originally when it was produced. And that the setting is something which can be separated or distinguished by, for example, roles and characters, but still they are functional according to their criteria. And also that is something important for the aesthetic value. And therefore, in conclusion of this point, what I've told you is that, Madam Speaker, things like sculpture, although they do not fit their criteria, they're useful in the artistic value, and furthermore, even based upon their criteria of functionality, for example, to show the setting, those nudity is extremely important, and therefore they certainly have the artistic value, and on that, they're extremely powerful.
You want to lower the temperature?
Yeah. Yeah.
Increase? Or increase? Oh, we do that.
Okay. All right, please thank you, previous speaker, in the first exchange. We now welcome Deputy Prime Minister.
We think that side of the House, the opposition, has missed the boat of what was argued comprehensively in KK's speech. What KK told you here today was that gratuitous nudity very often leads to a massive amount of harm upon the general public that watches those things. We argued how this would essentially offend people on a very fundamental level due to the kind of sentiments of public morality and decency that currently exist within the expectations. More than that, we also argued that there will be an increased level of sexualization because of the tendency to objectify when you use them merely as props and not as characters and human beings, or at least people with value within particular storylines. We argued that that was harmful and that undermined the way in which people appreciated the human existence, people appreciated human sexuality. That was the harm we stood for. We didn't think we had heard sufficient response that came from that side. A couple of points of rebuttal before I go into my speech, which will tell you about how our policy essentially strikes the right balance in kind of advancing ideas such as, reducing the phenomena such as bodily shame, etc., to the general public. But before I go into that, rebuttals. The first thing that they argued here to us today was that this art might still have some degree of artistic value, right? But they fail to appreciate the kind of characterization, the kind of nudity that we're referring to here today, right? What we're referring to here are situations where people are having sex randomly in particular scenes, not being part of the story, merely serving as clear distractions to titillate individuals. More than that, say for instance, one example of heavily sexualized nudity would be showing people changing their clothes, on a day-to-day basis, being nude, when that's clearly not necessary, but meant to, for instance, titillate and kind of, act to the kind of prejudices that currently exist, or the wants of people that exist, which is an argument that KK made, the very tendency to want to see a particular actor or actress nude in a changing scene is the kind of thing that we want to militate against. What we don't stand for, or at least what we won't censor, obviously, are things that flow within the storyline, that have narratives, different kind of trade-offs. We argue here today, Madam Speaker, that there is a harm that comes about from nudity, and we recognize there is a benefit and utility that serves through artistic freedom and artistic expression. The question is, how do you best balance it? We argue that on our side of the house, you strike the right balance by allowing for people to be able to be exposed to things that don't necessarily objectify, but try to advance the human sexuality on a purposeful level, and that's what we are proud to stand for. But what else did you hear from them? We heard from them that, speech has a particular purpose. Everything is free speech. We argue, no thank you. that sometimes we have to balance free speech against the kind of public interest, overarching public interest that exists. And we think it's quite important here when you have these scenes being aired on TV to a large, massive population that have the potential to create oppressive types of norms and perceptions of particular types of people, of individuals, particularly women, right? For instance, we argue that the kind of objectification, the kind of scenes that, or these by the way, obiter kind of scenes that will be depicted within the kind of world that they live, or within the status quo, has the particular effect of feeding into the existing norms and demands of people within society. So for instance, you always have a particular type of nude body that's being shown within changing scenes. You have a particular form, like what is ideal, like airbrush, certain kind of body measurements, etc. We think there's a particular conception of a standard that will be enforced and imposed on a much higher level, on a greater level extent, just for the purpose of titillation. We think on that level, we think artistic freedom and the kind of speech that we talk about has to be balanced here. The kind of level of artistic merit in gratuitous nudity is something that we don't really stand for. Before that, yes.
Yeah, so magazines also enforce a norm of beauty, even if the models aren't nude. You need to show some sort of exclusivity on your side of the house for any of your arguments to have meaning.
So the first couple of things. So on magazines, first of all, you don't have nudity and out, right? But if you do have out nudity, in the case of pornographic magazines, we think the kind of expectations that people go about reading those things are quite grossly different from those who are watching TV on a day-to-day basis. But more than that, there's some level of community standards when you think of people, females within bikinis and the like. The thing about it is that nudity remains the bastion of some of decency that people don't currently accept. And to that end, we think it's important for the state to draw the line in order to balance it out. But what did they tell us then? They told us like, well, that some sculptures have artistic value in the way in which they're depicted. Couple of points with rebuttal. The first thing, we think that many instances, the kind of gratuitous nude scenes, right, are able to be easily substituted in creating the same level of mood. More than that, we think that very often, like the kind of examples that they pointed out, like things such as statues of Michelangelo and like, always serve to try to push forward a particular narrative of the beauty of the human body. So if you look at like Michelangelo's work, in many instances, there's some degree of imperfection that's being shown. So we argue that the kind of physical depiction of beauty under those circumstances can and should be, or at least you should be measured, right? We are not against nudity that serves purposeful depiction and purposeful advancement. What we are against is the kind of gratuitous nudity that we've been seeing that's pervaded in media in many shows, such as like Game of Thrones, where you have random sex scenes that seek only exclusively to titillate and to increase and to rent seek. No, thank you. What am I going to explain to you here today? We argue, ladies and gentlemen, that it's very often under their policy that allows carte blanche, kind of approaches, that it will increase the level of oppressiveness that will exist within like society, or in terms of like body image and the like. What do we mean by this? We argue that the kind of incentive of producers to produce when it comes to like random types of scenes is always to try to veer towards the popular sentiment. We argue that as a result of this, what happens is a generalization effect that it has and it entails that particular form or particularized form of art. What do I mean by this? The simple phenomenon is this, that the moment people recognize that there are this type of gratuitous sex scenes, people are generally turned off to engage within those kinds of like particular forms of art, in the way in which they receive the nudity. They're likely to not want to watch those shows at all. So that creates a kind of chilling effect to the level of appreciation of art because it offends certain moral sentiments. As opposed to when you put it as part of the story. We argue when you put it as part of the story, what happens is that there is a focus on the director to try as far as possible to depict some degree of the human experience, some degree of a particular form of narrative. We think that's very likely to be more palatable for individuals to see nudity as a part and parcel of like human life, as a part and parcel of the human experience. That's what changes under our model. Because we argue that because if you have this policy like ours, right, what happens is that directors are more likely to have to conform to the standards that are being placed by the media board, and as a result, produce films that are tasteful, they are more likely to be accepted by a wider audience, and not be as easily struck off. To that end, we argue that nudity then creates, or at least nudity then is advanced as a positive norm to the extent it allows for people to kind of rationalize it as not just mere sexual scenes to titillate, but parts of a film or piece of art that seek to kind of move forward a particular storyline, to move forward a particular narrative. That's how you create, that's how you reduce the level of taboo against like nudity at large. We argue, ladies and gentlemen, that our policy is the one that strikes the right balance between expression and protecting society. We propose.
We'd like to read the speaker for his speech, and would now like to welcome Deputy Opposition Leader. Period.
their definition of gratuitous is a circular definition. In response to my POI, they just said, they said, oh, well, we're not talking about nudity where it has artistic value. We're just talking about nudity where it's not part of the story and it is therefore gratuitous. But what we told you on our side of the house is there's lots of kinds of nudity that aren't part of the narrative thrust of the work, yet still have artistic value. They need to defend banning nudity even when it has demonstrable artistic value, but it is not part of the narrative argument. And they never address that. They simply said it's, all this is gratuitous, it's like not that different from porn. But they never address the nuance of our argument about how different kinds of nudity can have artistic value even when they're not functional, or they're not part of the narrative. And the response to this was like very tricky, like, oh, well, we think that art furthers the narrative of the beauty of the human form. But where do they draw the line with that argument? If they admit that that nudity that is not part of the narrative can further some other thing, like the beauty of the human form, and they accept that as being valuable and legitimate, then where do they draw the line between their imaginary gratuitous nudity and the nudity which is furthering the beauty of the human form? We think that all people are beautiful to some extent, and seeing the form is itself an aesthetic experience. This is what Yuki brought you, and they can't distinguish between those two things, so they have to lose on those grounds alone. Then they try to tell us lots of arguments that have no exclusivity, like it changes the standard of beauty. All images of women that objectify women change the standard of beauty, but not all of those images have to feature nudity. In fact, we probably say the magazines that reach millions of people have a much larger impact than a few 100,000 people who watch Game of Thrones. So they're not even addressing the problem that they want to fix. So furthermore, they told us that nudity, their justification is that nudity is a standard that people don't accept and that people don't want to cross. That is not a criteria for banning something. There's lots of kinds of art that people might find shocking, like statues made of dog excrement, or other kinds of extremely shocking art, like Jesus Christ submerged in a bottle of urine, which is another famous fairy art piece. These things are also shocking. They need to tell why they're only banning nudity, which they find shocking, but not anything else that people find shocking, not a legitimate criteria. And then they tried to tell us, go ahead.
Assuming but not conceding that this nudity you're defending is artistic, how is this nudity received when all these people see is a sexual object and a tool for sexual
Because they
gratification?
don't necessarily see that. When people see a statue of Venus, they don't think, oh, look at this disgusting sexual object. They think, look at the beauty of the female form. Yeah. It's also possible that when people watch, and this is another thing they try to say, they try to say that this takes away female agency or something like that, or it turns them into only sexual objects. We say, take Game of Thrones, like Prince Oberyn's consort, who is incredibly sexually assertive and dominant of men through her nudity and through her sexual acts. That's a kind of affirmation of the power of the female form and power of the female body. And they were never able to address that either. So we think that all of their arguments are just not exclusive or not really relevant to this debate. And most importantly, they never talk about art. This is a debate about art and they never talk about it. And that's what I'm going to go talk on in the bulk of my argument. Because what we say is that nude forms just don't inform the setting. They're not simply means of aesthetic pleasure, but they also have symbolic meaning within art. And that's another thing that they're unable to address. What we say is take the very famous French painting Liberté, which has a woman with her breasts bared standing at the head of a legion of French revolutionaries. This is not a narrative element. That woman did not literally exist. She does not literally lead French soldiers. But what we say is that that nudity has intense symbolic power for evoking the power of that art. It shows bravery. It shows the immense strength and power and intensity of the soldiers. And those aren't narrative elements. Those aren't part of a story, but those are the symbolic meaning of art. Likewise, you say in Edward Hopper's Nude on a Bed, the woman is curled up in a fetal position naked, clearly after sex. If she was in her underwear, it would also be clearly after sex. But the nudity invokes a kind of vulnerability within her person that can only be expressed through the form of nudity, even though it's non-narrative. So on all these issues of art that we brought you, they were just never able to engage with us at all. But furthermore, we think that this kind of nudity furthers feminist discourse. How does that work? What we say is under their model, they're afraid of the female body. They think that women can only be viewed as objects, that women's bodies, as they said, are somehow inherently insulting or inherently gratuitous. And it's only when there's a distinct narrative that somehow they stop being insulting or stop being gratuitous. But what we tell you is in order for female sexuality to be accepted, we need to recognize that the female body is not an insult to society. The female body is not some gratuitous, disgusting object which offends the eyes of all who see it. Rather, the female body is something that should be celebrated. Female nudity, female sexuality, the symbol of female sexuality and sexual power is something that we need to celebrate in society. But moreover, we say, having lots of nudity can also make men into sexual objects, which might be beneficial for discourse as well. Because when women make lists on BuzzFeed about the hottest nude hunks of Game of Thrones, we think that that creates a positive discourse against the idea that only women can be sexual objects and that men cannot. So we think that having this nudity, they just don't show the exclusive way that feminist discourse is harmed, because we think it creates lots of benefits for feminist discourse as well. And then finally, I just want to talk about this issue of how they said that this form of art is extremely objectifying women vis-a-vis other forms. What we say is probably the most objectifying forms of art don't feature nudity, because the people most offended by sexuality, most offended by the female body, are the people, usually most against women's rights. I give the example of highly religious films, or those kinds of work. These are the kinds of people who think that the female body is insulting. These people don't want to see female bodies. We think that all the movies probably produced in the 50s were fairly regressive towards women, even though they didn't feature nudity. And what we say is that having nudity as part of the discourse, it just doesn't guarantee that it's objectifying. In fact, it may be liberating, as I gave you the examples of the extremely powerful female agents from Game of Thrones and things like that. So what have we told you today? We showed you that none of their arguments are exclusive. They haven't shown the necessity of banning this vis-a-vis anything else. They haven't shown why, just because this is insulting, we need to ban it vis-a-vis anything else. We have told you consistently the artistic value of nudity, even when it is not of narrative importance. And finally, and this can further feminist discourse by telling society that the female body is not an insult, it is not gratuitous, it is not something to be ashamed of. And for all those reasons, we are very, very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Come on. Thank you, previous speaker, and the second exchange. We'd now like to welcome to the floor the government whip. Here.
Opposition in this debate has never defended the position that free speech is an absolute value. They've never defended the position that regardless of artistic merit or the offensive nature of the piece of work or speech in question, that it should not be banned in an instant. They implicitly accept, in fact, that artistic merit versus offensiveness of the work is a standard by which we should determine whether or not the government can police a particular role in this debate. Their defense, therefore, has only been two things. First, that nudity has artistic value, and second, they implicitly concede, in fact, that nudity has offensive value. But they say that since it is not any more offensive or objectifying than any other form of sexualization, we should therefore not even try to police the limits of that. I'm going to therefore ask two questions in this debate. First, I'm going to talk about the way in which state governments can regulate speech and why we think it's possible for us to at least police the limits and the political boundaries in extreme forms. Second, I'm going to talk about whether nudity inherently has artistic value. Talk about the first thing, about rights and government can police. Because I think we were very clear from the beginning that rights and speech exist in the context of society, that exists in the context of society that protects rights in order to advance specific goals. So we protect, for example, artistic speech and artistic merit and and these kind of things, because we recognize that art is a particular value in pushing boundaries of society and in changing people's minds. That's why we are very okay with things like excrement and things like pieces, because we think that offensiveness in their nature advances a particular artistic purpose. It furthers a story, for example, of religion being shit or religion being part of excrement in that particular context, right? So in that particular case, then we accept that while it is offensive because it furthers the narrative, because it serves a purpose, we think that's okay. They say, well, look, a whole bunch of other things like magazines, like for example, women in bikinis, like half-naked men, these things also represent offensive values. I think we said a number of things at the beginning. First, the context in this debate is clear. It is in a society where we more or less accepted that people walking around in bikinis and half-naked is fine. We are not offended or necessarily offended by those things anymore. We recognize that they do objectify. We think that nudity presents a particular extreme in this particular instance. First of all, because it still offends the community standards of decency. So they say that, for example, everyone can be offended, therefore offensiveness is not a metric. But we think what governments do today is that they recognize that in certain instances, because that while we shouldn't judge or ban certain things just because they are offensive to some people, but they're offensive to a vast majority of people, and particular community standards, the state acting as a moral local society, acting as the way in which individuals experience their moral sentiments and express the moral ideas about how society should be constructed, is able to regulate in that context, and that nudity falls within that particular framework. We further told you that nudity exists and more objectifying rather than like things like bikinis and like people half-naked men. Because we argued to you that the visual imagery and the visual impact of seeing things that are the new taboo, or seeing things about naked bodies is something that's immediately viscerally apparent and hits people in the face. And we argue that something that doesn't necessarily exist or is a further extreme in this model. Even if it is more or less objectifying, even if it's about the same level as other forms of sexualization of individuals, we argue that it's legitimate for us, that it's right for us to police some boundaries, to set some limits, because they've never accepted. They've never argued that the state should have no limits at all, and we argue today that in terms of attempting to at least make some effort in mitigating this process, we're very happy to set particular limits. Then they say that look, we should just celebrate nudity, celebrate the female form, that's not offensive. Our first argument is we don't think every single form of nudity inherently celebrates nudity, right? We don't think nudity in porn is something that necessarily improves the way in which people view women. So if you want to say that nudity is like we should celebrate nudity because it enhances the visual of female form, we agree, but it should only be celebrated in the context where the nudity actually furthers the storyline instead of just presenting a woman as an object to be viewed by the audience and just there because people like to see naked bodies rather than because it serves a purpose, because we care about the woman as a person, as part of a narrative, rather than just her body. That's the way you celebrate the female form, right? We think further to that. We say, now the good thing is that men can be sexual objects too. We think we are happy to say that no one should become sexual objects. We are against the sexualization of everybody in general. Let's talk about the next thing, about whether nudity has inherently artistic value. Before that, go.
Why are you okay with banning nudity when it offends social conscience, but not banning anything else when it offends social conscience?
Look, so the distinction here is offensiveness versus artistic value. And that's the second part of this particular debate. Because we recognize that offensiveness alone shouldn't be a reason for us to ban particular things. That's why this debate is whether or not when nudity is only offensive, when nudity serves no artistic value, that's when we ban it, because then we think the trade-offs that cannot be expressed in speech lend towards banning particular objects, right? So offensiveness is a reason, it's a harm that existed upon individuals. Recognizing that speech has certain value, we put the trade-off towards protecting speech. When the speech has no value and it's just offensive, it's just sexualization, it's just objectifying, that's when we think the line is drawn at banning a particular form of speech and banning a particular expression. Let's talk about whether nudity inherently has artistic value. See, there's a reason why all the examples that opposition can talk about are statues and paintings. That's because they have no understanding at all of the way nudity is presented in modern media. They have no understanding of the way, for example, in particular scenes of Game of Thrones, where there are people talking about storylines and just prostitutes having sex in the background for no reason at all. There's no celebration of the female form or celebration of the human body. It's just people having sex, right? These aren't like statues and paintings inherently. There's no story. By definition, you can't tell a story by sculpture. So we argue to you that in fact, the nudity serves an artistic value because it advances certain narratives that sculptures are designed to do. So they can't say, look, Statues are nude, people appreciate nude sculptures, therefore all nudity is inherently artistic. That argument makes no sense, and it doesn't even engage the modern context in which nudity is even used and portrayed within status quo. We argue to, therefore, today, that there's a fundamental distinction between seeing bodies just as bodies, when people actually, nude bodies in particular, are essentially used as props to advance, like props and background scenery in a particular storyline, as opposed to instances where these bodies are relevant not just because they are bodies, but are relevant because we care about the person, because we care about the kind of narrative, the ideas these artistic works are trying to do. That's when these things have artistic value. When the state says it's fine to err then on the side of free speech. But in the absence of that, in the absence of them showing us how modern media, and especially the way people perceive and interact, they consume that particular media, presents artistic value. In the absence of that, we think when you only have offensiveness, when you only have objectification, that's when we're very happy to say to ban that. That's why we're very proud to propose.
Hold on. We thank the previous speaker and would now like to welcome the last constructive speaker of the round, the opposition witness. Here.
There are three fundamental reasons that NUS has to lose. The first reason of which is that they believe that nudity is a synonym of random sex that somehow appears in movies. That's obviously a very narrow concept and understanding of nudity. Nudity is not only about that, it's also about art, setting, and symbols, symbolic meanings. All of those things still constitute of nudity. They're narrow concepts, even if they believe that nudity is only random sex and they oppose that, they're not proposing the motion, because nudity contains all of those things, and you have to ban all of them in its entirety. And so given that nature, that there's some nudity which constitutes art, setting, or symbols, your burden of proof has explained why those ones should merit banning as well. But the second problem with the entire case is the government said, well, we're not supporting absolute free expression. We're not a crazy libertarian, right? We told you from first speaker, the line we drew is when there's imminent physical threat. In the same way, we don't allow expressions with fires on people's houses for sake of their expression, right? Or we don't kill people because of their expression, right? As long as there is no imminent threat. That's the line we defend. Unlike their arbitrary nature or somehow discomfortable for certain communities, and that's so subjective saying that we don't like to agree. The third problem with their case is they don't have the understanding nor consistent stance toward what story is. Story is not a synonym of artistic meaning. Duh. Story is not of story. That's why Prime Minister's setup was like this. It's irrelevant from movie lines, and that was only the scrap of debates that they tried to explain, right? All the other things which doesn't have story still have meanings and art and setting, and all of those things were completely neglected. Before I move on, I'll give you a chance.
Do you agree that seeing something that's offensive presents particular psychological harms to individuals?
It depends. If on the level, and that nicely leads on to my first point. So first, let's examine the test of banning. Because this debate is about banning something, because you only allow expressions to be only in limited cases. So they need to explain step by step what is a yardstick of banning, and it merits banning to begin with. That was the burden of proof of their side. Let's examine, and you have to prove this is unregulatory, and banning is the only mechanism that you have to do. So let's examine what they try to say. The first of all attempt they heard was, some minors or some communities who do not want to see are affected. For those people who don't want to see, just don't see it. It's already rated, and you have a chance to opt out. So basically, their analysis, so we're not having nudity to be visualized on the people who you don't want to see. So that's obviously what's ridiculous. Then we heard from this. I love this analysis of uncomfortableness. So being uncomfortable is a test of banning. Uncomfortableness is not a test of banning, but allowing expressions. Because we have to analyze here the individual, how they feel and digest those expressions. We're totally dependent. And according to, even if like one person on the street believes it's uncomfortable, you have to ban absolutely everything. In the same way the before World War II Japanese government was actually doing. No, thank you. And given the nature, there's always things of extremely subjective and uncomfortable. Let me give you some examples. Like gangster rap, which says "smacks a bitch" by Eminem, is obviously sometimes discomfortable. We still allow it, and
an era, violent content such as violent video games or violence in movies, so it has all of these things has discomfort, but we still allow it. For example, the movie of saying "Do the Right Thing," which caused a tension between Black and South Korea in 1989 in the United States, caused discomfortness to South Koreans and Black communities on the ground, but we still air it because all of those things you cannot draw the line for exactly is comfortable or not comfortable. So comfortableness is obviously not the test. That's why we support imminent danger. In the same way, we don't allow expressions to directly hurt others. Obviously, that's the answer to his POI. No, thank you. As long as you can prove step by step how harms or imminent and threat to individuals' body, you cannot really ban it. No, thank you. Then we heard this analysis of objectification of sexualization. First, we told you from first speaker, not all arts are necessarily intended of objectification. It has artistic value, such as, for example, the portrait of statues of Venus. So they're not comprehensive in doing that. But second, they have excessive problem-solution mismatch, right? Because obviously, even under your model, if it has certain artistic value, and somehow, I don't know how they're gonna actually functionally explain step by step how it's objectification, not objectification, they still have expression with big boobs or nudity, etc., which does go objectify certain communities as well. And these allow things like bikinis as well, which is, or like on their underwear, it's not completely nudity, so they have excessive problem-solution mismatch on their side of the house. Then we heard, well, the line to draw functionality, like what's functional or not, is very clear. They never ever told us, even a single minute from their 20-month period of speech, how you're able to draw what's functional or not. They magically say you're able to determine what's functional or not. Even though that functionality or this intention by these viewers or intention by this artist cannot be seen and cannot be quantified, right? You cannot simply see an art and say, oh, this is 37% subjective, 37% offensive, that's why you have to ban, right? These are determined by ordinary individual who believes in different perspective of what offense is, what constitutes nudity is. So you cannot, as long as you can draw the line, it's much, much more better to leave it up to very tangible litmus test, which is the imminent danger and imminent threat. The final point we heard was akin to hate speech. They have this self-burden to prove it's similar to hate speech, but then if we explain step by step how is hate speech. Like how the heck is like Apollo or Statue of Venus akin to hate speech? If you sincerely think that's the case, you're seriously diluted. No, thank you. Second, let's move on to the effects of banning. Because what the concession we heard from them is there's going to be obviously a chilling effect when it happened. They only ran away with rhetoric of balance, but the question is whether that balance is something we accept or not. We've told you 4 levels harm from this side of the house. The first harm we told you was going to dilute artistic value, such as statues of Venus, Apollo, or Michelangelo, all of those things. They said you can easily substitute it. I don't know how you're going to substitute statues of Venus. Like, how are you going to have it's actually impossible to do that. Then that's not fair to the modern context by Gabet. It doesn't matter. There are some values which have artistic value regardless of the context, such as statue of Venus. So their analysis was simply missing the point. The second thing we told you from this side of the house, from first speaker, was an analysis to serve as a setting. It's not a story nor narrative, but it's something that shows to fathom your understanding as a setting. In the same way you have women naked to understand this a setting in form of objectification and the current context of that moment. The third thing we told you from Thomas, as nudity has symbolic meaning in the same sense of evoking the power or signs of vulnerability. All of those symbolic meaning will be lost by their policy, but never been dealt from Hongyu. The fourth thing we told you from this side of the house, it's going to damage feminist movement. It's going to say women still have to believe that their nudity is offensive and insulting and cannot be proud by themselves, cannot use body as a tool for yourself and ownership by themselves and be proud of it. Their policy said women have to be locked into the certain gender stereotypical norm, and that was fundamentally offensive. And with that, we oppose.
We thank the previous speaker and would now like to call an opposition reply. Hear, hear.
I'm going to explain very simply why they've lost. They said we're only justified in banning these things when these things have, the first thing they said, when these things have no narrative purpose. They changed that in the middle of their case to we are justified in banning these things when they have no artistic purpose. But narrative purpose and artistic purpose are not the same thing. Narrative is one part of art, but there are many other parts of art. An abstract painting that's just colors thrown on a canvas has no story. There are no characters. There is no narrative. It's merely an aesthetic, visual experience. But that is also a form of art. Now, given that art does not have to be narrative, they need to prove why, even when nudity is fulfilling these other forms of artistic merit, it needs to be banned. And they never addressed that. All they said was, well, we're not talking about that. We're talking about Game of Thrones. Well, we're not. We're talking about all media. You can't only talk about Game of Thrones. You need to talk about all different kinds of art and why you need to ban it in all those cases. Now, their only other justification was that it's offensive. But they don't want to ban anything else that's offensive, which is another thing we find confusing. Clearly, like, dog shit Christ is not, like, is pretty offensive. And nor does it have any like real narrative purpose. It's not telling a story. There are no characters. Yet for some reason they're fine with dog shit Christ, but not with like breasts. So we don't understand their own criteria about offensiveness, about why it only applies to this and not to anything else. Now let's move on to their harms that they brought us, because they said there's basically two harms. One is that children will see it and they'll get some sort of like sexual idea. Well, we say it's fine. Don't show nudity to children. That's the status quo. We're fine with that. That harm disappears. The only other harm they were able to bring us was that somehow it objectifies women. But they didn't tell us how this objectifies women any more than anything else, or why this objectifies women to a greater extent. What we say is that there are examples such as standards of beauty are far more pernicious in like widely distributed magazines than they are in HBO shows. We also say that it's not clear that art which doesn't show nudity doesn't also objectify women. If you have a highly misogynist narrative, even if there's no nudity, like you are objectifying women. Yet they're also fine with that form of objectification. They're only not okay with objectification when the woman has breasts out. Like we don't understand any of their exclusivity on this side of the house. Like furthermore, we say it may be far more liberating for women when, like, even if she's not a main character, even if we don't know her name, a woman is dominantly having sex with a man where he's beneath her and she's controlling the sexual act. Versus, say, a woman fully clothed shopping and doing housework in a magazine. They never showed that these things like are more objectifying towards women than anything else that they're fine with. So we think that all of their harms, like they're just like picking them at random. They're like nudity might have these things, and we don't like nudity, so we need to ban it. But they never showed any exclusive necessity for banning nudity, or how nudity is any different from anything else. Moreover, they never debated on art. They just like switched their meaning in the middle of their case between narrative purpose and artistic purpose, and ignored all of our analysis about how nudity is symbolic, about how nudity creates setting and feeling and emotive state, about how nudity can be aesthetically pleasurable in the manner of statues. And by the way, there are modern statues that are nude too. It's not just 1,000-year-old Greek statues like Rodin's The Thinker, which is a male form completely in the nude, probably has artistic merit, yet they would ban it under their side of the house. So if the criteria they put forward is only ban it when it like doesn't serve narrative purpose, they're not protecting art, which is what they switched to in the middle of their case when they said, well, we're only going to ban it if it has no artistic purpose. But then finally, they just gave no litmus test on their side of the house for determining what's artistic and what isn't. They just claimed, like, well, clearly this isn't artistic. Clearly this Game of Thrones is not artistic. Like, we know that it's not artistic. But they never showed how they can determine that. They never showed why they're going to be able to determine like what is gratuitous and what is artistic, given that they give us no test or no analysis. And for all those reasons, we're very, very proud to win.
Next, the opposition 5, all-time government is 5.
We were the only ones in this debate that weren't obsessed with the deep end of the loop, and were able to engage with this debate with realistic understanding and depictions of what actually happens in the media and how the audience receives it, right? And all they wanted to talk about was Michelangelo. What exactly did we say? They came out in reply accusing us of changing tack and not defending something new. Let me revisit what exactly I said in my first point in my PM speech. I talked about where did we draw the line. And I gave you two examples, which I'm going to revisit to demonstrate that we actually didn't change anything, right? We talked about things like intimacy, about how Kate Winslet in that particular scene demonstrated her willingness to give in an intimate manner to Jack, right? That doesn't necessarily say that I am therefore yours and in a narrative way, but that still told a story. That was what we defended right from the start. We also defended last caution, whereby there was a power difference between the two individuals, and that was part of the story. Symbolic in a way, but ultimately still told a story of the power difference. So for them to just say symbolism is not the story is ultimately a lie. And we say that ultimately the narrative is part of a massive number of symbols that continue to move in a time fashion, right? And so how do we determine this debate then? We determine this debate by deciding where we draw the line. And we have decided that in this debate, there's the balance between offensiveness and harm versus what they were trying to defend, which is aesthetic merit and freedom of expression. So let's take a look at offensiveness and harm and what we have defended so far. We have provided you several arguments and several problems that we have illustrated with limited engagement on their side. We told you that there was an increased tendency by producers and directors to objectify women in a certain way when that particular scene doesn't require that particular nude scene in the first place. That they are used more often than not as a tool to attract and titillate. And so as a result of that, what more often than not happens is that this nudity is depicted in more objectified forms, which creates harms in the way that people understand and perceive sexual identity and sexual norms. That was never engaged with. We also talk about how it is also problematic in the way that it's received, right? When the nudity is not part of the story, people just see it as a way, as something that is there for sexual gratification, as something to jerk off to, rather than to appreciate as part of the relationship between human beings. Everything that adds to the objectification that people see of particular groups in society, especially women, given that that's where how society is being organized right now. And we gave you the most realistic discussion of how nudity is used, right? In terms of how that nudity is depicted in changing scenes that's completely unnecessary and there's no artistic merit. We also told you about how there are people like screwing the background that performs no particular sort of purpose within that particular story, be it symbolic or narrative. So we think that all they have done so far, the best response they had was to say, well, it's not as bad as everything else. And we don't think that's adequate given the kind of harms that we've given. But let's take a look on the other side, right? Aesthetic narrative. Beyond telling us and giving us an art history lesson, they have not been able to give us one single example in modern media that depicted aesthetic and symbolic value within the particular nudity, right? In fact, members of the what we show you is that aesthetic merit is useful insofar as the way that it's been received. So when the audience look at it and all they think about it is how big those boobs are, we don't think that there's any aesthetic merit because aesthetic value or artistic value, because that's not how the audience look at it. So how do we make that particular trade-off? It was only very in opposition with it. They say that, well, we're going to defend things like imminent danger. But at the end of the day, it consists of the idea that when there is harm, we need to make sure that we engage with it and balance it out with the kind of benefits that we get out and the utility they get out of the particular expression, right? And they have never told us why is it that normative harms that we've told you about are not as important. Given that we have demonstrated clear harms on our side, and they have only demonstrated ambiguous value at best on their end, and we have given you a more realistic picture as to how the media will react and certain aesthetic structure that exists within this debate, we think we very, very clearly take this debate.
We thank all the debaters in the House. We invite everyone to cross, shake hands, and leave the room. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks.
We try to have 7 minutes.